Hi guys, thank you for your patience. Very briefly, we have Reserve.org with us. We have Nevin Freeman from Reserve.org. Reserve.org is a team backed by, P2P, Coinbase, Sam Altman, all the biggest crypto venture capitalists that you can think of. I'm not gonna say anything and pretend to understand cryptocurrency, so I'm gonna let the man who does understand it take it away.
Great, thanks for having us. Hi everyone. I'm excited to join you guys here at London Business School and talk about our take on cryptocurrency. So first of all, thank you to the associations for having us here and to London Business School. So how many people in the room own some cryptocurrency? Okay, good amount, cool. And how many people own more than 3 cryptocurrencies? Okay, cool, all right. And how many people in the room own at least one stablecoin? All right, just a couple, okay. And then has anyone read about the design of a stablecoin before? All right, a couple, okay, cool. So, all right, so then I'm going to, basically what I'm gonna do tonight is I'm gonna talk about what we think is happening now in cryptocurrencies and what we think is going to happen in the future in cryptocurrency and why we think that's a big deal. I'll keep it at a pretty high level, so I'm not going to dive too far into all the technical details because it gets pretty complicated pretty quickly. But then during the Q&A, if you guys want to go into any part of that, I'm totally happy to do that. We can talk about the details of how exchange rate pegs work or the different approaches to stablecoins, the details of our approach. But to start off, I just want to talk about kind of on a high level what's going on here. And so first of all, I'll just tell you quickly who I am and who my team is so you know who you're hearing from. So this is my team. We're based in Oakland, California in the Bay Area. And we've been working on this project for about a year. And here are some of the organizations we've worked with before. So you can see we kind of come from a Silicon Valley background: Google, Tesla, OpenAI. A bunch of the people on our team have a background in artificial intelligence. It's something we care a lot about. Some people have a background in cryptocurrency. We also have a background in nonprofits. So a bunch of the people on our team have done a bunch of things in the past, thinking about like, what are the impacts on the world and how do we make sure that things turn out well? And one thing that we've spent a bunch of our time on is building this movement called effective altruism. Has anyone here heard of this movement, effective altruism? Okay, yeah, a few of them. Okay, cool. So it's a pretty simple idea. It's just that if you want to do something to impact the world, especially if you're looking at like charities, for instance, a bunch of them just don't work. And then a few of them do work. And if you think about it and you look into it deeply enough, you can figure out which ones work. You can actually understand the direct impacts. And this isn't just about like how many dollars go to the program versus fundraising or whatever. We don't really care about that. It's more about like per dollar that you put in or per pound that you put in, like what actually comes out the other end. And so this is a thing that a bunch of the people on our team have spent a lot of time building. We built a movement around this. So this is the first summit for effective altruism. We crammed a bunch of people in our house in Oakland and then grew it over the course of time. This is the conference a couple years later. And then the year after that, this is in Berkeley. And so we've sort of seen this movement blossom, and that's something similar to what we're going to be trying to do in cryptocurrency. This is, we did another smaller event just a little bit ago in our office space at Reserve. So this is something that our team cares a lot about. And this, there's kind of 2 ways that people in effective altruism end up relating to cryptocurrency projects. Either they're excited about the direct impact, like what will actually change about the world if that particular distributed ledger technology actually makes it out there, or they just want to make money so that they can go donate to the things that they care about, or fund the things they care about, maybe invest. And the people on our team are no exception. We kind of care about both things. So we're excited about the possibility of making money because we have all these things we want to fund. And then we also picked a project that we're quite excited about the direct impact if it really works. And I'll be talking about that tonight. Bit of social proof. So we've done some fundraising and gotten a bunch of exciting crypto funds to invest in our project. Way more than I'll list on this slide, but including Coinbase, Digital Currency Group, Block Tower, and Distributed Global, and then also Peter Thiel, Sam Altman, and a whole bunch of other angels and crypto funds. So that's us. That's the intro. And now I want to talk about like the problem that I think that cryptocurrency could potentially solve. But it really hasn't solved yet. There started to be news about how this problem has kind of been solved by cryptocurrency. I think it has not at all been solved yet, but I think that it could be solved by cryptocurrency over time. That's what I want to try to convince you of. So, so basically, right now, in Venezuela in particular, there is a case of hyperinflation. You guys know what hyperinflation is. Basically, when money starts to lose a lot of its value to the point where you really can't buy almost anything with the money that you've stored up. And hyperinflation is pretty rare. It doesn't happen that frequently. It happened in Zimbabwe a little while ago, and it's happening in Venezuela now. It's not like it's happening in dozens of countries around the world. But when it happens, it's really bad. So, this estimate is that, this crisis has put something like 90% of people into poverty. That's terrible. And this image kind of shows what that looks like. So these are some tomatoes, and that's the amount of cash you would need to buy those tomatoes right now. And that's this, images are useful sort of connecting with this circumstance, imagining, like, what if that's what it looked like if you wanted to go spend your pounds and buy tomatoes? That's crazy. Or like, that's how much you need to buy a roll of toilet paper. It's out of control, literally. But hopefully you guys can read this. But like I said, hyperinflation is only happening really in one place right now. But if you look at just inflation generally, like the inflation that's sort of at the scale that's significant enough to impact people, even if it's not what we would call hyperinflation, that's actually happening in a lot of countries at once right now. So the way we count it, there's something like 16 that have 20% or higher inflation. According to the IMF, it's like 11, depends on where you get the numbers. But this list includes basically a bunch of countries that have 20% or higher annual inflation. And if you think about that, what that means, that's like a 20% tax on all of your money every year, or a 50% tax on all of your money every year. Not just on your income, but on all of your savings. And when you sort of go measure these things on the ground, instead of using those official estimates, the numbers often look significantly higher. So these are numbers that have been measured by this guy, Steve Hanke, hopefully that's the way to pronounce his name, at Johns Hopkins, literally like a week or two ago. These get updated every week, where you go actually look at the black market exchange rate for the currencies on the ground, and then you can estimate in real time sort of what the inflation rates are. And this is the relevant column to look at. So it's like, we have Venezuela, which is crazy, but then 284%, 179%, 128%, 126%. There's a lot happening. And it really does impact the people that are there. And until recently, it was a bit hard to kind of connect with this in any visceral way. I like the fact that a lot of people raised their hands and said they're holding some cryptocurrency, because that's actually a way that we can kind of relate to the experience of what it's like to hold a currency that's losing its value that quickly. So I love this chart. So we've reworked this for this slide, but someone put a chart on the internet of cryptocurrencies and how much they've lost their value against the US dollar in 2018 versus other fiat currencies and how much they've lost their value versus the USD in 2018. And so what this means is that if you bought crypto sometime last year and then held it between December and now, you know what it feels like for your currency to be losing its value that quickly, right? But you kind of have to take it one step further. You kind of have to think about, what if that was your only money? What if you had worked really hard to earn that money and to save that money, and that was all you had? You didn't have the ability to trade out into pounds or Tether or anything. And you were just dependent on that, and it was losing its value that quickly. And in some cases, that's just how the money in your region has been for years. And as far as you can tell, there's no end in sight, right? That's a pretty soul-crushing situation. You sort of can imagine like the degree to which people might kind of lose faith in their ability to just economically transact and save money and sort of live a normal economic life in the way that we take for granted. And And so, there's some people in these situations that really don't have enough money to save anything anyway. And so for them, in a sense, it doesn't really matter. They're kind of living hand to mouth. They earn some money, they spend it. The fact that the rates are changing doesn't really make a difference. But it's hard to kind of get out of that position, right? As soon as you start earning more money, then your money is losing its value once you've saved it. And so it's a pretty bad situation. And so, but then stepping back, there's an even bigger sort of perspective on all this, which is here now we're looking at the value over about 100 years of the US dollar, right? So this is a currency that is not thought of as being highly inflationary, but over the long course of history, even highly successful fiat currencies like the British pound or the US dollar end up losing almost all of their value to inflation. And so, from that macro perspective, sort of all of them are subject to these forces. So let's think about what does that actually mean? Why does this matter? So to understand sort of what inflation like this means, I think that it's important to have a grasp on fundamentally what currency is and what it allows us to do. So imagine that I give you a cake, right? And you're like, okay, great, I have this cake. And imagine we're friends and we hang out all the time. If I had given you that cake just out of the blue for no particular reason, you might have a bit of a sense of maybe I should give Nevin a cake, or maybe I should do something for Nevin, right? Maybe I should, whatever, give Nevin a ride to work or something, right? Well, that sort of basic force of us tracking well, this person gave me a cake, or this person gave me a ride to work, or whatever, and then kind of balancing that out, paying favors back, that's the thing that we all kind of do naturally with our friends and our family and people that we know well and relate to, and sort of small groups where you can all keep track in your head of kind of how that balance is going, right? And if you think about what money is, it's kind of a tool for doing something like that on a much, much, much bigger scale, right? Where if I in fact gave you a cake and then left and went on to back to the United States or whatever, and we never talked again, well then there's no way for you to pay that favor back. And so generally speaking, we don't randomly give gifts or do things like that for strangers, right? Well, why is that? Well, I think fundamentally, at least in part, it's because we know that there's nothing that will come back to us as a result of that, right? It's hard to just randomly cooperate with total strangers because sort of, we need help from others, and so it's important to make sure we have circumstances where that help will occur. So then what this means is that if I give you a cake and you give me some British pounds, then even if we never interact again, I've gotten some sort of reward for that favor, and I can go hand those pounds to someone else, and they can give me a ride to work, or they can give me a chicken, or whatever it is that I want in that moment, right? And so fundamentally, the act of the cake giving is still sort of a favor. We don't think of it as a favor if someone paid for it. But really, at a basic level, it still is a favor. It's just that you also had this currency transaction to track that the favor had occurred. And so, from my perspective, what this means is that if you look at all the things that we do for each other when we are paying for things, whether you walk into a grocery store and get some milk, or you go into a bar and get a beer, or more complex financial transactions, it's all just a big crazy network of favors that's going on that's being tracked by the financial system, right? That's kind of basically what capitalism does for us, is it allows us to interact in this huge, crazy pattern of favors all around the world all the time. Capitalism has a whole bunch of problems as well. Not saying it's perfect, but that's kind of the cool thing it allows us to do. Okay, so if you're with me on that, then how many of you are with me on that? Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay, all right, great. So then from that perspective, inflation is that record of favors sort of going away over time, right? Where let's say I hate to use the cake thing again, but let's say I give you the cake, you give me some British pounds, and then like a year from now, the pounds are like worth half as much. What does that mean? That means if I wait a year with my money, and then I turn around and I ask someone else to kind of like repay that favor, I get a favor that's worth half as much. Like that's what inflation is. And so if you're working and saving money in an environment with high inflation, fundamentally, you're having to like do more for others in order to get less help from others in the future or from society. And that's why inflation is bad. It's sort of a fundamentally less cooperative cycle. And so that when I ask myself, like, what does this really mean and what are we trying to affect? That's what we're trying to affect. We're trying to take the situations that are less cooperative and see if there's a way to make them more cooperative. Why does it happen? Why does inflation occur? Well, there are, the specific sequences of events that lead to it are very complicated, and I don't pretend to be an expert in them, so I won't go through all the details because I'd probably be wrong. But fundamentally, over the course of time, if you increase the supply of any asset class, of currencies in particular especially, but any asset class, the value per unit will tend to go down if the net value of the total set of the things is the same, right? And so if you imagine, you're a government or you're like a private bank and you have the ability to create money, well, when you create that money at the very beginning, you sort of get to call in the first favors of the cycle, right? You didn't have to do any favors to get the money, you just printed the money, and then you can spend the money and receive favors sort of as it enters circulation. And so fundamentally, if you imagine having that power, well, it's very tempting to do that, right? Because you can just sort of get anyone to do anything, at least anything that they're willing to do for money, by creating money. And so in sort of the highly functional governmental situations in the world, this only happens at a very slow rate over the course of time. And so you see more money entering circulation at a slow rate. And there, by the way, lots of people have arguments for why a bit of inflation is actually good, and I'm not necessarily arguing against that. It could be that that's true. But in the circumstances we're talking about where the inflation is notably higher, it's often because that power is abused, where essentially, for one reason or another, the combination of the bank, the central bank, and the government decide that the strategy they're going to implement is to print sort of more money than would allow the currency to stay stable. For various reasons. Well, actually, no. I'll even speculate on this. So if you imagine you're a politician, one thing you can do in order to get elected is to try to provide public services for your citizens. Well, that costs money. And so if you then want to provide more services than you actually have a budget for, one way of doing that is spending money you don't have and going into debt. And oftentimes, if you look at these sorts of governments, that will occur. And then a way of getting out of debt is simply printing money, right? And so the desire to sort of please one's citizens and get reelected leads to going into debt through overspending, which leads to printing more money. And so then in a sense, the printing of extra money is kind of an implicit tax on everyone because it's devaluing the currency they have in order to add currency to circulation. So, end of rant on why this is happening. So, what is the goal? All right, so if we want to try to impact this, as cryptocurrency entrepreneurs, one thing we can try to do is to make a currency that has an unbreakable commitment to not inflate. So what do I mean by this? One of the cool things about cryptocurrency that came into existence with the Bitcoin protocol and now is present in all these different, well, not all of them, but many different cryptocurrency protocols, is that you can pre-program the monetary policy. And so, and you can basically create a system where the number of tokens in circulation is just automated. It's just a function of the code. And no one can change the code because it's being run by like so many different computers all around the world. And so, instead of a situation where there's a government or a central bank that can sort of decide in any given year, like, oh, we're going to print a little bit more this year, a little bit less this year, you can actually pre-commit. As such that when people opt into using that currency, they're opting into using a currency where everyone can predict what that monetary policy is going to be in the future. And so monetary policy people will talk about the difference between like rules versus discretion in monetary policy, where a rules-based approach is like you decide in advance what you're going to do and you just follow those rules. And then a discretion-based approach is like, actually sort of allowing human judgment to control what happens from a monetary policy perspective. This is sort of the possibility for the ultimate rules-based approach, where you can literally hard-code rules and then just proceed based on those rules on into the future, for better or for worse. If the rules are chosen poorly, then that could be very bad. If the rules are chosen well, then that's good because then you don't have the opportunity for sort of corruption based on humans. So we have our goal: make a currency with an unbreakable commitment to not inflate. In particular, so here's where we sort of, we'll talk about Bitcoin in a moment, but this is where we sort of diverge from the Bitcoin approach. So the Bitcoin approach to this was very basic, right? It was just deterministic scaling of supply that would eventually asymptote at 21 million coins and then never go above that. And this is very interesting to a lot of people because if you have a fixed supply and increasing demand for an asset, the price has to go up. And people are very excited about prices that go up, right? And so this is part of what has led so much attention onto the cryptocurrency space, is that these fixed supply asset classes with, that are getting increasing adoption mean prices are going up, and so speculators are very excited about that. But if we want the value of our currency to stay the same across time, so that favors that are always sort of paid back one-to-one, then we need a supply to actually match demand, right? Pretty basic economic principle. So instead of a supply that scales up in a deterministic way, we want a supply that scales up in response to demand scaling up, or scales down in response to demand scaling down, which is the hard part for a stable cryptocurrency or any pegged currency, or just stable currency at all. And so, right, so we want something where supply scales with demand, where, like we said, nobody can print extra for themselves. And then number 3, we'll throw this in there, a really cool benefit of cryptocurrency generally is that you can transact with anyone anywhere, right? You just have this single open database. Anyone can spend coins to anyone else anywhere, no matter what country they're in, whether the sun's up, etc. So why not Bitcoin? Kind of just went over this. So there are a couple of issues with Bitcoin that we didn't mention, right? So there's speed and transaction costs. These are issues that are sort of technologically being solved by a bunch of people in the cryptocurrency industry. I will not touch on them tonight. And then price volatility. So really what we need is a cryptocurrency that has a value that doesn't change over the course of time. So if the solution to these issues is in fact a stable cryptocurrency, I believe that what will happen is that they will be able to replace sort of floundering fiat currencies now, some of the ones that we had up on the slide, and then potentially all fiat currencies eventually, right? Because of that long-term progression, where if you look at over the course of 100 years, fiat currencies are losing their value, even the best ones. It may be that stable cryptocurrencies that are stable over that long period of time as well, not pegged to those currencies, but actually stable when those currencies are going down, end up outcompeting them. Okay, so there are 3 approaches so far that are being explored to create a cryptocurrency that has a supply that scales with demand. So let's talk about those a bit. So one is sort of traditional asset collateralized. And what that means is you take some traditional asset, oftentimes a fiat currency like the British pound, and you store that currency in bank accounts. So you can send, if I'm the issuer, you can send me some pounds, I'll put those in a bank account and I'll give you tokens that are backed by those pounds. And then anytime you want, you can redeem the tokens for the pounds. And so the idea is if it's like 1 token, 1 pound, well then that token's basically worth a pound because you can always swap it for a pound. And so if someone offers to sell it to you for half a pound, you're like, well yeah, that's great. I'll happily buy that for half a pound and go redeem it for a pound, right? And so that arbitrage opportunity in the event that the market price goes below 1 pound, causes people to want to go buy those and move the price back up. And so that basically holds the price at 1 pound is the idea. And there are several in circulation like this. They generally work until they don't. So the question is always, number 1, is the money actually there in those bank accounts? Which when you look closely at banking situations, is not like a yes or no situation, right? Banks can end up insolvent, or governments can put pressure on banks, or banks can like be forced to not do that redemption process if there's a suspicion that the system is permitting money laundering, what have you. Okay, so that's the first approach. Then there's crypto collateralized. Well, this is interesting. So you can do something that's the same sort of setup, where you send me some money and I issue you a token, but it could be that you send me cryptocurrency and then I issue you a token. And this has a major benefit and a major drawback. So the major benefit of this is that now we don't have to deal with the banking system. A lot of that uncertainty can go away because this can all be sort of pre-programmed, where you send me, let's say, some Bitcoin, that gets locked up in a smart contract, and some token gets issued against it. And then you know that you can always redeem that for that locked up Bitcoin, because you can just read the code in the smart contract, and as long as there's no bug and there's no sort of attack on the network that's successful, then you know that you can always redeem it. Sort of the code is the law. And so then there's no sort of question about like, well, is the human party on the other end going to be willing to redeem? Is the government going to stop this redemption process? No uncertainty there. The downside, of course, is that now you have a token that's backed by Bitcoin. Well, what's the point of that? Bitcoin is not particularly stable, and so that doesn't really help you out much, right? The whole point is we want a token that has a stable value. Well, some would say, you can solve this problem via over-collateralization. So let's say you have, 10 Bitcoins, and then you issue a token that's only supposed to be worth 1 Bitcoin. And so you have 1 Bitcoin backed by 10 Bitcoins, or 1 Bitcoin worth of token. Well, then the idea is if, and then let's say you're measuring the value of those in British pounds, okay? So then the idea is if the price of Bitcoin is moving around such that the number of pounds worth of Bitcoin is like fluctuating all over the place, if it's over collateralized enough, as long as it doesn't go below here or wherever you need it to be, then you can always redeem your token for enough British pounds worth of Bitcoin, right? So that's like the basic idea behind the over collateralization approach. And there are some teams that are doing this. There have been failed projects in the past that did this, and there's some sort of successful looking projects that are doing this now. The problem, of course, is that you never know exactly how much it's going to fluctuate. And so if it fluctuates too much and goes below, then maybe you won't be able to redeem your token for what it's worth. The third is what's commonly referred to as non-collateralized. Well, how could you have something that's non-collateralized? How would that stay stable? Well, the basic idea with a non-collateralized stablecoin, they're called, is that if this stable cryptocurrency gets adopted and grows in volume in terms of the number of the coins and how much people are spending them in the future, well, then maybe there's some way for that to be profitable, right? Maybe you can earn profit from like transaction fees, or maybe there's some other way that you can sort of make money off of the system existing. Excuse me. If that's true, then you can create a second token in the system that sort of has rights to that profit in the future, right? And this is a lot like shares in a company, right? So when someone invests in a company, you're buying basically a slice of that future revenue. And those slices have value because the market sort of predicts that the company is going to produce revenue in the future, even if it hasn't yet, right? There's a lot of companies where they haven't really produced any profit, where they haven't made any distributions, but the fact that they might in the future gives those shares some value. And so the idea is that you can essentially create shares in your currency system and then use those shares directly in some form or another to back your currency, right? Because now you've kind of created this new currency that has some value. Now this is a little bit circular because it's like, well, yeah, if it's going to work, then there will be revenue, and so the shares will be valuable. And so then if everyone believes that, then the shares will have value. And then you can use the valuable shares to buy back the tokens out of circulation if you need to, and thus keep the price stable. And then if that works, then the thing will work and will get adopted. But you can see the circularity there, right? And so the issue with this approach is essentially that you could potentially have periods in time where the market starts to doubt, it really seems like this particular cryptocurrency isn't going to be adopted. And if that happens, the value of those secondary tokens could go down very quickly, perhaps. And if that happens, then all of a sudden your collateral token isn't worth enough, and you can no longer back your normal token, and so the peg could break. And then the problem with that is now you're in a cycle, right? Now you further cement the idea that it's not going to be adopted. The value of those tokens go down even further, and it's pretty hard to recover from that. So the interesting thing about that approach is that if you look at the way that sort of independent floating currencies are managed, in a sense, they're sometimes doing similar things, right? Where you have like government bonds that are kind of like shares of future revenue and so on. And so that's kind of where this idea came from. But I'm a bit skeptical that it will work in the cryptocurrency case because it's so speculative. Okay, so in closing, I personally think that over like 2019 to 2021, we're actually going to see cryptocurrency, like crypto assets that really work as currencies, tested for real, sort of for the first time in the wild. I think up until now, all we've seen is this interesting speculative bubble of sort of roughly fixed supply crypto assets. We're going to start to see lots of real world experiments of like what happens if you put crypto assets that are stable in value in the hands of people out there who could actually use them, like the people we talked about at the beginning of the presentation. I think that 2021 to 2023 or so, we could start to see substantial adoption, maybe even mass adoption, in these emerging markets in particular. So I do not think that cryptocurrencies are going to replace the British pound with the US dollar anytime soon. Maybe in the long term, but not anytime soon. Why is that? Because those currencies are fine. They're basically functional. I think that they're going to have more of a shot at replacing these currencies that are highly non-functional. And then perhaps by something like 2100, I can imagine them being the default form of money everywhere because of a lot of advantages they have, some of which we've talked about tonight, some of which we haven't had time to go into. Sort of if you have, if you're like laying awake at night wanting to think about something interesting, like think about the fact that cryptocurrencies really are like digital cash. Like they are sort of this digital object that can be transacted from one person to another directly. That ends up having a lot of implications, in my opinion. So thank you. We can go to questions now. If you want to learn more, you can email us at contact@reserve.org. Follow us on Twitter and Telegram. We haven't released a white paper yet, but we will be doing that quite soon. If you join our Telegram group, we'll announce when we do it. We're also hiring. Check out the open positions at reserve.org. So thank you. Yes?
I have a few questions.
Yeah.
Maybe first of all, are you building this on Ethereum? Is the logo implied?
Yeah, so the question is...
Hedera Hashgraph as maybe your team.
Yeah, good question. The question is, are we building this on Ethereum or Hashgraph or something else? The answer is that it's a combination is our plan. So we're planning to build the core part of the protocol on top of Ethereum. And that's essentially because of a couple of reasons. One, it's sort of tried and tested enough that we think we can trust something sort of this valuable, if it really works, to actually run on top of it. And then the other is that a lot of newer protocols, they're interesting to us. We think that they have promise, but they haven't existed for long enough to have solid development tools. And so it's really hard to check that your code doesn't have bugs. And with Ethereum, it's not easy. Like the whole thing's still quite young, but it's just far enough along that we felt good enough actually developing on top of it. So Ethereum, but then also you can easily peg a token from the Ethereum platform onto a token on like EOS or Hashgraph or something else.
Building some sort of oracle in between the chains or atomic swap piece.
Yes. And so that makes it so you can lock up the token on one and issue a virtual token on the other, and that will mean that essentially you can spend the stablecoin across the different platforms.
You lock it up on Ethereum, and then you mint and burn on it.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. Have you got any roadmap on which you're going to go after?
Good question. Basically, our strategy is just going to be anything that gets adopted that people are enjoying using. We will add a peg to it, I think. Yeah, I'm not 100% sure, but that's basically what we're thinking.
Then conceptually, I think one of the promises was that your currency will not inflate, but part of your asset backing is US dollars or tokenized US dollars. And also in the beginning, you will peg it to the price of US dollars. So it's sort of like broken twice. So when is it going to shift away from inflationary?
Yep. So the question is, part of the promise is that in the long term, the currency won't inflate. Well, if you're backing it with US dollars, and especially if you're pegging it with the US dollar, well then of course it will inflate. That's right. And so the promise, I guess, is a little bit less bold. It's like eventually we'll reach a steady state where it won't inflate from there. At the beginning, it will, because it will be pegged to the US dollar. And so eventually you'd want that portfolio to either not contain any US dollars or contain some US dollars as like a low risk but inflationary asset that are then offset by other assets that are expected to appreciate.
Do you have any more information about the basket of assets that you're going to tokenize? Like what amount of US dollar, euros, or real estate, or sort of gold, or?
No. So the question is, do we have information about what that eventual basket will be? I don't want to make any like promises about what that basket will be because there's a lot to like study and learn and figure out, and it'll be like a large community decision. So the thing I'll say about it is that we're not going to try to do anything fancy in terms of asset management. I think we're almost certainly going to just stick to like standard wisdom when it comes to like low risk assets. Yes?
Also two questions, Joanne. Firstly, the initial US peg, so if I understand it correctly, you're basically pegging it against a basket of Maker, Basecoin, and Tether, as a broad. So that's the concept conceptually, right? Or not?
So roughly yes. So but there's a thing I want to make sure is clear. So the question is, for the initial peg to the US dollar, are you sort of just pegging against these other stable coins? The way to think about it is that we're trying to peg it in terms of purchasing power to the US dollar, not to those stable coins.
Yeah.
But we're holding the stable coins as collateral. Yeah.
Cool.
Yep.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
And then just to follow on your question, I guess, so if you're collateralizing against the US dollar, which has a low margin of inflation but is inflationary,
Mm-hmm.
but as you're moving away from the US dollar to a basket of other assets, like gold to some extent is also inflationary, right? As new supply of gold is found. So all of these, even though you might be moving to US dollar, all these other baskets of assets, right, also have their inherent underlying inflation rates.
Okay, so the point is, well, don't all assets have some underlying inflation rate? I think, so could be that this is wrong. I believe that that's not true. I think that if you look at like the price of gold, even over like 1,000 years, at least compared to the dollar, it's dramatically less inflationary. Because roughly speaking, the supply is about the same. We do mine more of it, and interestingly, we actually mine more of it in response to the price of it going up. So it's kind of stabilized from the top but not from the bottom. And then likewise, if you're holding like 10-year government bonds or things like that, those are not sort of subject to the same like monetary policy rules of quantity and price and so on, because they're just sort of a security, right? So you don't just have to hold commodities or currencies. You can also hold securitized, basically like fractions of future income from different slices of the economy. And so I believe that we'll be able to hold a basket that is not on net inflationary. Yeah.
How will you deal with market makers or people doing the arbitrage and purposely wanting to short bring the price down?
Yeah. So the question is, how do we deal with, I'll just say, people who want to short and purposely bring the price down? So there are two answers to that. So one is, if you are fully collateralized at any given point in time, then there's no concern there, right? Okay, that makes sense. So then the issue is, well, what if you're temporarily under-collateralized? What do you do? And that, by the way, I do think will sometimes happen. I'm not saying we'll structure a portfolio that will never go down in value. It will in some cases. So the way that our system works, let's see, do we have slides for this? I don't think so. So the way that our system works in that case is to temporarily expand the width of the band of the peg. Let me explain what I mean by that. Normally, let's see, we're in the phase where we're pegging to the dollar. Normally, the peg will actually be a very, very narrow band around $1. for reasons. And in the event, let's say that your collateral was worth 100% and it's gone down to being worth 85%. Okay, in that scenario, the width of the band would expand such that it goes from 85 cents to like $1.15, right? So it's a very wide band. Why is that? There's two reasons. So one is that you don't want a situation where you could have a run on the bank that sort of massively hurts some users, some holders of the token, right? A run on the bank, of course, is where a lot of people trade out and they get their money out, and then the bank runs out of money, or the smart contract runs out of money in this case, and some people are left holding nothing, right? We don't want that. And so by allowing people to convert at 85 cents in that scenario, you're sort of maintaining convertibility at the expense of parity in a way where you avoid that run on the bank possibility. This also avoids the possibility of a Soros attack. But it also, by raising the top part of the band, that also makes it so that if you want to short the currency in that circumstance, you are actually taking on notable risk. Because if demand for liquidity in that token actually is going up at that moment, the price could now float above the normal pegged price of $1. And so if you're shorting, you could actually lose money. And so this makes it so that you could still anticipate that shorting will occur in that circumstance, and in fact it may, but it's at least the case that people are taking on risk in order to short in that world.
Will Reserve be using market makers to stabilize?
Well, the question is, will Reserve be using market makers to stabilize at any point in time? We will describe how the system works to market makers. It may be that we decide to pay market makers to help, but we would want to make sure that we're not violating any laws by doing that. In principle, though, the system is not designed to require us to pay market makers to do it. It should always be that the arbitrageurs that play a part in our system and the market makers that play a part in the system do so out of their own personal desire to profit and do so in a way that's legal. That was sort of the design approach that we took going in. So the idea is the system is not dependent on us paying market makers. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi. So you mentioned 21 to 23 years being the key years where you see a lot of adoption of cryptocurrencies taking place.
Yeah.
What are the kind of transactions that you see adopting cryptocurrencies first? That's one. And second is, what are the efforts from your end right now to make sure that some of this adoption actually takes place?
Yeah, good question. I should probably add this to our presentation. So the question was, I talked about foreseeing actual adoption of cryptocurrencies. What use cases, like what would people spend it on? And then are there any things we're doing to actually cause that adoption? For the first question of what I see it being adopted for, interestingly, a lot of people, when they're thinking about stablecoins, are thinking about means of exchange and like using it to buy things. Because it is more practical to use something that's stable to buy something than to use Bitcoin. And we've seen like all of the vendors that were dealing with Bitcoin are like largely moving away from it. They're like, this is a hassle, we don't want to do this. However, as far as I can tell, the network effects on a means of exchange are really, really strong. And I think perfect evidence for this is what's happening in Argentina. So we went and spent a week studying what's happening in Argentina to try to understand this. And in Argentina, the peso is losing its value. I think it's something like 40% per year right now. Don't quote me on that. Do your own homework. But and they're allowed to buy dollars. And so you might think, well, maybe they're all just going to switch to spending dollars. But that's not happening at all. Very, very large transactions, like buying a house, are often done in dollars. But almost all normal commerce is still done in Argentine pesos. That's also, but noting that if you have any amount of money there, you actually always convert it to dollars to store your money. So everyone has a savings account in dollars, but then they convert out of dollars into pesos to go do their transactions. Well, why is that? Right? Why not just have everyone switch to dollars if they're all holding dollars? And I think that it's simply because there's so much infrastructure and everyone is already everyone has the plan to use the peso. And so unless you somehow have some coordinated switch where like the government comes out and says, this is what we're doing starting 3 months from now, everyone prepare, or something, it's really hard to switch people over. And so you, in a situation like that, where you're allowed to buy an external stable currency, or where you're not allowed to, but you do it under the table, you see these two currency systems developing, where the stable currency is used for savings, and then the volatile or inflationary currency is used to spend on things. And that's what I foresee happening with stable cryptocurrencies in these emerging markets. I don't think that they will quickly be adopted as a means of exchange. I think that they'll be adopted as a store of value. And people will still, because of the network effect, continue to use their local currency for means of exchange. Now, it may be that we can facilitate like sort of relatively circular or closed digital ecosystems where once everyone's holding the same currency, you can start just transacting in it. That's something that we're interested in exploring. And it may be that over the long course of time, eventually you facilitate a switch somehow. But I would be surprised. So that's my thought. And then on the second question of what are we doing to facilitate this? In any situation like this, it's even if the product is really great, it's unlikely that like people are just going to randomly adopt it, right? It can happen from time to time, but generally what happens is enterprising entrepreneurs will find existing very, very large networks of users and then find some way to offer the thing or incentivize that entire network to adopt it all at once. And that's essentially the approach that we're going to be taking. So we are in conversations with people and businesses that have large networks in these emerging markets about finding ways to offer the thing to their users. And we only want to do this in a case where it's actually really good for those users. We don't want to like force this down people's throats. But it's the sort of thing where you can offer maybe a small monetary incentive for people to try it out, and then if they like it, they can keep using it. And so examples there are like telecom companies that have huge networks of people that are constantly purchasing minutes. We've seen an example of this right with M-Pesa, where people switch from purchasing minutes to also purchasing and selling digital currency, and then using that as a means of exchange on their phones. If you haven't read about M-Pesa, go check it out. It's amazing. But then also, like cell phone distributors, that like preload apps onto phones, another thing to keep in mind here is that a lot of these parts of the world, people don't already have digital cash. They're often just dealing with physical cash. And so something that we're interested in, we just met a person who's running a crypto bank, he calls it, in Ghana. And the way that it works is really fascinating. There's like 50,000 users right now of this service, and then there's 1,000 mobile tellers. And the mobile tellers literally walk around sort of like a paper route to 50 houses per day with a phone and allow you to exchange physical cash for them either sending or receiving a crypto transaction on the phone. And so you can deposit your cash, so to speak, and like receive crypto that you hold yourself on your phone. It's like self-custody, I think. And that's the form of distribution that makes sense in that environment, right? Where we would never think about that making sense here. So the answer is things like that, lots of exploration. We have some partnerships in the works that we'll be announcing before too long. So the question is, New York State has basically come to a certain regulatory standpoint on this. Do we intend to comply with that, or how do we plan to deal with that? What can I say about this? So I think that the regulatory question for humanity of how we want to deal with cryptocurrencies is very complex. And the answer, I believe, has not been discovered by the New York Department of Financial Services. I think that it's like one tiny piece, and there are going to be a lot of different regulations that develop over the course of time. It's going to be a crazy hodgepodge, and eventually we'll end up in some overall paradigm, hopefully one that's sensical. Our overall perspective is to try to think about the fundamentals of what the regulations are there to cause and to prevent, and try to figure out ways of sort of going forward in this currently relatively unregulated area that will end up matching, future laws and things that make sense. So what do I mean by that? It's sometimes useful for governments to be able to follow the money and stop crime, right? To prevent tax evasion, to prevent terrorist financing, and so on. And we don't want to be a vector to allow people to evade taxes and fund terrorism. And so we look for technological ways to prevent that. Now, at the same time, we don't want to create like a future state where the government can see every single tiny transaction for every person and sort of spy on everyone all the time. That seems unnecessary. That seems bad as well. So we want to create a technology that doesn't allow that. And so, generally speaking, so then sort of cutting to like how we're thinking about this. We're essentially trying to produce something that works like Bitcoin in that it is pseudonymous, where if you have good operational security, people can't tell who's holding which tokens and who's sending tokens to whom. But in practice, if the government really, really cares, they can probably figure out what's going on in many circumstances. So it's kind of like a lot of anonymity by default, but not really full anonymity. We're also interested in potentially extending that and offering a bit more privacy, which is possible via zero-knowledge proofs. But if we do that, we don't want to necessarily offer full privacy. That's something that we think could actually be quite bad for the world. Yeah, so there's a thing called a zero-knowledge proof, which is basically a way to have like a version of Bitcoin that's really truly anonymous, where you can't tell who's holding the coins. There's no public ledger that you can decipher and tell the pattern of spending in the past. And we're interested in potentially using this technology to offer more anonymity, but we think that that can go too far pretty quickly. And so in our explorations of how to use zero-knowledge proofs for our transactions, the way we think about this is like, well, maybe that makes sense to offer in limited amounts. Maybe if you can allow citizens the ability or users the ability to spend limited amounts fully privately, then you can sort of say, well, they can't do anything that bad with those private transactions. And as soon as you spend more than a certain amount, then governments would be able to track that, or maybe you just can't spend more than that certain amount. You can tell by the way I'm talking about this that I don't have that fully technologically planned out. But we have a lot of designs we've thought about sort of in the lab. And that's something that we, via our governance mechanism, would be able to add in the future, and something that we are quite interested in. Okay, thank you for sticking with me. That is all for tonight.